Bring out our friend Daniel Logan, guys. That's the way to do it.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, my friend. How are you today?
I'm not too bad. Yeah, having a wonderful day. Flew in late last night, so.
About to say, when did you roll in?
I got in about 9, 10 last night, so I try to do only Saturday and Sundays now.
Gotcha.
Were
you coming in from LA?
Yeah, Orange County.
Orange County, yeah.
I got a little clone of myself now, so he's just turned 5, so
yeah.
I try to be a good father and be there on his Friday and then leave on Sunday, so I can be there on Monday to get him back to school, make sure he's not misbehaving like I used to do.
Learn from the best. What's I mean, parenthood, like I'm not a parent, so I'm not going to pretend to speak from experience here. So with your lifestyle, with your industry, with your brand and stuff like that, like how does parenting change all that for you now that you're shifting these balances? Like where does that create these challenges and excitement for you in your life now?
I mean, I've always wanted to be a father. I think if you guys see him at the table, I'm very engaged with the kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They're really the future, you know, and I just kind of act like at a convention like I'd wanted someone to treat my child before I was a father. And now that I'm a father, I'm like, wow, hopefully you guys just ignore my child. He's got so much ADHD, you know, he doesn't stop. So, I mean, for me, it's more just trying to introduce him to the world of Star Wars, but not overly indulge him so that he gets turned off of it. Yeah. I have a huge Star Wars collection. I mean, I
think it's an understatement.
Yeah, my Star Wars collection's probably about 300,000 pieces or more. Yeah. So
right.
I got a lot of different stuff, and one of the fun, challenging things is trying to keep him out of my office because I have very expensive Star Wars collectibles, and some are limited editions. So I've collected them for a while, and then he comes along, and I'm watching the Book of Boba, and he comes in the living room. He's like, "Daddy, I'm sorry, I broke your trophy." And I'm like, "I haven't gotten a trophy in years. What are you talking about?" So it automatically clicks. Oh, it must be something in my Star Wars collection. So I run into my office, and he's broken a pre-Vizsla.
Wow.
Yes, little bust.
Yeah.
And they go for about $1,000, and I'm like, oh my goodness. Like my mom would have just beaten me, you know. She was like, "That's our fortune." And whoosh, where me, I'm like, well, now you've lost a little bit more of your inheritance.
Different kind of generational trauma there. It's like this guilt.
You know, I'm like beating myself. Like, why'd I leave that out at a height he could touch? But we went to the Star Wars celebration this past year, and my wife had handmade him a young Boba Fett outfit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so one of the cool things was like watching him with his long little hair. He looks exactly almost like me walking around, and she was hoping he could get photos of people, but I was kind of greedy, and I kept him in the green room with me. And then when I was signing and stuff on the stage, so I could tell my wife was a little sad because she was like, "Oh man, I worked so hard for months on that, and he didn't even get any pictures." Yeah. So I was like, you know what? I'll just take him out onto one of the main stages with me. So I took him out on the main stage, and like he was a hit, you know. And I try to keep him off social media. I try to keep him, you know.
Not protected, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I had no choice. At that point, it was like, you know, 10, 15,000 people sitting in that audience, you know, and he just stole the stage. I mean, they were like, "Oh, is he shy?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think he's shy." And he's like, "I'm not shy." And like, it's all being recorded, you know, and I'm like, "What? Oh, you're not shy?" And so then the next one, he's like, "Yeah, no, I'm not shy." And then he started going off on his little rants. But yeah, I think for me, it's just, Star Wars is so huge, you know, and it's a continuous of generations. So I felt as you never know, like my Star Wars was my Star Wars, and our Star Wars, I guess, and the original series was the generation before, and now this new generation have their own Star Wars. So you never know what the next generation Star Wars will be and what kind of characters will come. But I always train him that Boba Fett is the best, you know, his favorite character.
Getting him right. That's the right way to do it. It's like, so obviously like Star Wars as a fandom can be very divisive, and it's just very combative because there's a lot, but that comes from a place of love inherently. It might be a little misguided at times, a little misplaced, a little toxic, but that's because there is such a protective ownership. So like previous generation Star Wars and stuff like that. So like being able to step back and go, no, this generation, this is their stuff. This generation, this is their stuff, because we now have 3 generations worth of movie storytelling.
4.
All these now with the TV shows and stuff like that, you know. So we like it. It's a little. There's everyone's got a place at that table, right? So trying to get people down for that. Where was that turning point? Because you got involved in the franchise, obviously very, very young and early. Do you feel like that kind of influenced your collectible path? Because you're at that young age, you're like, oh, look at these knickknacks, these toys, these collectibles. Do you think because you got in at a young age, that led you to be a collector, or just because, no, this is just kind of like how you've always been?
Well, the thing is that because I was so young in Star Wars, George Lucas used to send me these boxes to my house, and the boxes were almost the same size as the table.
Yeah.
And they were just full of Star Wars toys. And so you open them up, and I grew up in New Zealand, and I could just smell America, in the box.
Right.
And, that plastic, brand new plastic smell. And it kind of got my addiction started from there. But then I'd go to these conventions, and then at the end of the convention, I would just start walking around all the different booths. And by the end of the time walking around, I'd basically bought someone's booth, full of all their Star Wars stuff with the money I made. So I go home to my wife, and she's like, well, how much did you do? And I'm like, oh, I got some Star Wars toys. It's like, wait, you bought Star Wars toys? She never saw the value in them.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, but these things will be worth something one day. They're my investments. And she's like, but you brought back nothing? And I'm like, yeah, but I got some more Star Wars toys.
Right. It's how you're viewing the assets, right? Yeah.
You got it.
It's the investments.
And it was all over the world, It wasn't just that I buy them in the United States. I'd buy them in England and Australia, back in New Zealand. And it was something that became very, very addictive.
Yeah.
And I think we're all searching for happiness, and collecting and stuff like that it becomes a form of happiness, as you buy, you're like, oh, I got it. All right, sweet. And that gives you that little rush of that moment of joy.
Yeah.
And I just kept on having these moments of joy after joy, obviously, 300,000 times. So
tell me you're undiagnosed ADHD without saying you're ADHD.
You
They're
got
like
it.
chasing that dopamine drag. You're like, oh, this is my reward. This is what I get.
Yeah.
You get that rush from it every time.
It's it's the instant enjoyment, and then you're on to the next. Like, okay, I got to get this next. What else haven't I got in the series? So, for me, it became a very big passion of mine to collect. But it's funny because during the pandemic, I went over to England where I have one of my houses, and I started storing like a guinea pig or like a beaver, all of my collection. And I was selling one of the houses, and I'm like, well, what am I going to do with all the toys now? So my wife's like, well, you could just, put them on a FedEx, bundle them up and ship them over FedEx. And I'm like, I don't think you realize it's not a FedEx size shipment that
it's like freight things, right?
Yeah. So she's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, so I started going through the rooms, and I think I showed it on Instagram one time. Like, it was like it literally looked like a hoarder's house. And she was like, are you, for the bad word, kidding me? I'm like, I told you I like to buy Star Wars stuff. And she's like, yeah, I didn't know you had it to that degree. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So I brought a 40-foot container over from England after I sold the house, and I packed up all the stuff. And as soon as the container arrived to one of my storage unit areas, she was there, and she's like, are you kidding me? She's like, you've got to start selling this stuff. We're not sitting on all this stuff anymore, Daniel. Like, you got to move.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, man. It's kind of like that addict that didn't want to give up on the addiction, And so I started a group on Facebook called Bounty Boxes.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe, get, a couple thousand people or whatever max, and some people might want to buy my stuff. And it's like, it's amazing because the group has now grown from a group, then it went to a community, and now there's like more like family, and it's unbelievable that just of one thought, really, it came from my wife, to get rid of my Star Wars stuff, which I pick and choose, I'm like, I'll give them this, but I'll keep that.
Yeah. This one's for me, this one's for them. Yeah, mentality.
And I still collect today, even though she doesn't like it. I'm like, yeah, but I needed to have this. I've always wanted this. But now, like, it's a family where people just send each other gifts, and they do like at Christmas time, people just do like a Secret Santa where they'll send different Star Wars collectibles to each other and stuff like that. And it's just such a very supportive group or family now, and it makes me proud because it's another branch of Star Wars which I was able to reach people and then also share in the stuff that I was able to collect for so many years. It's weird talking about my collection. I never really spoke about it before. It's kind of like my little secret.
We're your support group here. It's fine. Yeah, like it's a safe space. Like, I mean, like, I have a feeling you're not the only collector in this room. right?
Yeah.
So like you're among your people on so many
Exactly.
senses, so many levels of that too,
Yeah.
Because like you're like the neurodivergent urge to hoard, right? Like we're like our clutch or dragons and stuff like that. Like I gotta have this. Like I collect board games, for example, or like I've got a whole room with. I got more board games than a board game shop, and I always say like, all right, the next one I buy, it's not just the cost of that game. It's well, I'm gonna have to buy a shelf to put that on. Instead of like all these other intrinsic costs that come with that, right? Yep. But there's just something that comes from that joy of like, oh, I want this. I have the means now to get this thing. I might not be. There was a time where I wasn't able to do that for myself.
Right.
So now I've got this privilege, this means to do that. You're like. So yeah, let me just stock up on all of these things, right? Because you're right, you're getting that mental reward like every single time.
And it's funny you say that because I was always chasing the vintage stuff, and when I'd buy vintage from, a guy who collected it from the original, collector, he'd be like, oh yeah, that crap was on, the budget aisle, and I just figured I'd just buy it because it was cheap, and I'm like, now I'm paying them like hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars for that same thing, I'm like, cheap. But it's funny because now, the prequels have come through. It's like the red carded episode 1, the Attack of the Clones, Blue series, Camino escapes and stuff. They're now starting to raise in price as well.
Oh yeah.
And it's our generation. We didn't have them when we were younger, so we didn't have that opportunity to collect them. Well, I did, but most people didn't have that opportunity. So now they're trying to fulfill that void of what they never had when they were a child. So now they're buying up all these. New collectibles.
Yeah.
Oh, not new, I should say. They're old because they're all about 20 years old, and it's incredible just to see, like, what was I going to say? Yeah, I forgot. I start getting excited and I'm start thinking about other parts of collecting. But, it's just, it becomes full circle, know, and as the generations move forward with different years of Star Wars, the old collector or the new collector wants what the old collector used to be able to have, so then they're buying up what the old stock was, and then the new stuff, it's not quite there yet, but I mean, episode 1 and 2 weren't really there for a long time either, you're like, now you could sell like an Ahsoka figure, which she's only been around for like 2008. At one point, they were going for like $1,000 just for a figure on a card. Yeah.
And it was a unique character, right? Yeah.
The card was very rare, and you're like, this isn't even like 30 years old yet, 40 years old. This is literally like, I guess 20, a little less than 20 years old now, but they're still going for almost the same price as a vintage. Yeah. That took 30, 40 years to get
What's interesting too, you look at, so I don't know how old you are, I apologize, but I was born in 82, so I'm around 40, right? And so I was in that generation, like the elder millennial generation, where like I saw my Gen X friends having the means to buy all the original trilogy toys. I was like, oh, that's before my time. I'm already starting to see, the guys in the garages hoard the things. I'm like, that's cool, whatever. And so it wasn't until the prequel stuff started to come out that's like, all right, cool. Now this is my stuff. But jump in. But at that point, that's the nature of collectibles. Like, what's old is new and all that stuff again. But in that turn of the century, God, that feels old to say, but it's accurate. The turn of the century stuff was when so many of these products were being created compared to back then. Because when Lucas was starting to do the stuff, they're like, yeah, there's a toy market, I guess. It wasn't until a couple movies into it that he realized just how much of one was. So I remember when the prequel trilogy came out, your trilogy came out, it's like, there's just toys flooding the market everywhere. So there was that kind of oh yeah, our friends collect it because there's value. We're not going to buy that because that's not going to be valuable. But then you go through the same cycle of people forget about it, it disappears, and then you combine that with the early days of getting on chat boards, AOL clients, and starting the early days of social networking, where that's where people were coming together. It's like, oh no, I do want that, I do, and then you started to quickly see the value of these weird, not old pieces like the Ahsoka start to just skyrocket because the conversation was there.
It's just like Pokemon cards. Who would have thought if I would have collected all of my Pokemon cards? I was like, out with the Pokemon cards, in with Star Wars toys, but they still raise at good values too, but it's, I think you go back to your childhood and the things that you were nostalgic to you at that time, and you try to go back and reclaim that childhood, you know, if you lost those things or if you never had them.
Absolutely.
You want to then take them back and then enjoy them again, and so for collecting, it's just, for me, it's been a huge passion for a long time, and it's even fun now still letting some of my collection go, you know, and people, they'll come up to me and they'll be like, oh, Daniel, I think I bought this from you on your group. Can you sign this, Luke Skywalker Black series figure? And I'm like, but that's not me. He's like, yeah, but it came from your collection. I'm like, Sweet,
All
okay, whatever. There you go.
Just knowing that you touched it, right? It has that value with it too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very weird because being in this franchise for 20 years now, wow, it's just the same as you just said, 20 years. I mean, people are coming up to me now saying, "Oh, Daniel, you were my childhood." And I'm like, wait, what? I'm still a child. How can I be? And then I'm like, oh, I forget.
You stand up, you feel your knees crunch. Oh, crunch, right.
Yeah, you know what I mean? I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, I forget that I was so young in Attack of the Clones.
Yeah.
And I've been able to grow up with them, you know, in the same franchise and have that same passion. But it's just so weird now to have the prequel kids or prequel adults now still loving the franchise as much as the original trilogies loved their franchise. I mean, I grew up through the series of, oh, kid, your movie sucked. You know what I mean? You were the worst. Boba Fett, we weren't expecting to see his face, and we weren't expecting you either. Because you had all these original trilogy fans that just were so passionate about their characters that they weren't willing to open their mind up to George Lucas going backwards. You know, they were
that gatekeeping mentality of like the ownership that comes with
you
that.
got
right?
it.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like we were saying earlier. So they will rather have it continue forward than have gone backwards. You know what I mean? And I mean, for a long time, I would sit at conventions, you know, people were like, oh man, your movie was the worst one. What the hell was it? A love story? Star Wars isn't love stories, you know? And I'm like, oh, thanks for coming by and seeing me. You know, and I'm like, oh. But now after the turn of, 15, to now 20 years, you've got the prequel eras that they loved their Star Wars. They didn't know anything else. They did watch A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. But that wasn't their Star Wars. Their Star Wars was this new, lighter special effects, more cartoonish Star Wars.
Yeah.
And it fed to the newer generations. Now we have all special effects. If you watch The Mandalorian and stuff, they've got the
volume, the way they do all that. Yeah, it's like wild. Yeah.
So, I mean, they've been able to now continue with the generations time. What do you call it? Your focus.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And the focus is getting shorter and shorter.
Exactly. Yeah, the attention span and stuff like that.
So
Yeah.
you've got to be able to create that creativity to keep that, focus alive so that people are being able to stay engaged. I mean, it was hard for me to watch a 2.5-hour movie, and
Right.
I was like, wait, is it over yet?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm back in it. Okay, I'll watch it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, is it over yet? Oh, hey, show back up.
Yeah.
And that's why I love what they're doing nowadays with the shorter series and they're doing shorter stories because the kids nowadays, there's such a fast world that you still get your Star Wars, but you get it in a 45-minute, hour, and then it leaves you, oh, what's coming next week, and the Clone Wars for me was one of the best things to do after Attack of the Clones because it allowed me to get back into the storylines of Star Wars, but then allowed me to reach a whole new generation of people who had a shorter time, focus like I did. And then being through that, you're able to go through so many different stories and go through backstories of these characters that you wish you would have been able to see, and it just led ways for, everything from The Mandalorian to The Bad Batch and, and the future of what's to come. So I as a passionate Star Wars fan and an actor from the franchise, I never ever looked down on the next generation Star Wars because now the original trilogies, they're like, oh, okay, after the sequels come out, they're like, yeah, okay, you guys' movies weren't so bad then after all.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? I'm like,
a little backpedaling there. You're like, oh, 50 minutes is awful. Well, I mean, it's not this movie. I was like, well, we're all punching down, I guess.
You got it, and I'm like, whoa, that's not my generation to judge, that's someone else's generation, and eventually we'll pick it up because there'll be a next set that comes out and you're like, oh, they sucked. The sequels weren't so bad after all,
Yeah.
So that's kind of the passion.
It's a full circle, keeps coming, right? There's that ownership that comes with it too. Because like for me, like I said, I'm of an age where like when your trilogy came out, we were excited to have Star Wars, but we were like,
what the hell
bad Star Wars is better than no Star Wars at all, I suppose. But like I'm one of those people. I'm very easy to please in my circles. I'm like, well, you know what? We had a good time. We watched it. I know there was a turning point for me too. Like I'm like one of those home theater nerds, and like anytime I'd redo my home theater, I would use your movie to like test my sound system. Right? There was the chase sequence with the asteroids. I'm like, oh, that pushes my sound system. Being an audio designer, it's like, all right. Lucas and Williams knew what they were doing with that. So I would always find things to defend about these individual products because it wasn't yeah, you had like one bad thing, but like name me a movie that doesn't have these things, right?
Yep.
But we have this passion, this love, we're chasing this joy. So when it doesn't meet that expectation, that drop is so much higher.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's where people really get like defensive and kind of aggressive about the whole thing.
Like,
So
what do you mean Boba Fett's a little boy?
Right?
Hey, it looks like a little girl. What the hell is this? You know, that's not what we're expecting.
Yeah.
He's a mercenary bounty hunter under
Yep.
that helmet. Now he's turned into this.
Like, just you wait.
And I'm like,
Because how old were you when you got started in that? Like, 'cause, I mean, you were real freaking young for that,
yeah,
right?
like 12, 13.
Yeah.
I was filming. And I grew up in New Zealand, so we only had 3 TV channels, you know,
Yeah.
and Star Wars never came by. So I didn't know what Star Wars was. So when I got the audition to audition for Star Wars, it was kind of really crazy because I got into acting through rugby. That was my passion.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to become a rugby player, and that's what my dreams and my passion were every single day. And this milk commercial came at my rugby club, and my coach was allowed to put down 2 names. So he put down my name and his son's name from our team. So my Nana, she was like my mother. My Nana took me along to the audition, and I went and I auditioned for the main character, but because my skin color was a little too light, they were like, oh, but we really love this kid, so maybe can we put him in as the other character?
Mm-hmm.
So then I got this other character where I got pushed into the mud. So they asked me like, hey, can you, pretend like you fallen into some mud on a rugby game? And I'm like, oh, hell yeah, I do it every week for free.
Yeah.
So I just jumped off my feet and head first into the ground at the rugby club. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's the kid. We'll take you, you know. And so that was my beginning in acting. So then this lady fell in love with me when I was doing the commercial, and she was like, you got a lot of charisma, I think you'd be great for this business. How about we get you another commercial? I'm like, yeah, my mom raised us 6 kids by herself, so I'm like, yeah, does this one pay too? She's like, yeah, it pays. I'm like, oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, done.
Yeah, sign me up. So then I did a commercial after commercial after commercial to where the lady, her name was Pip Grove, I'll never forget her, she got me an agent. And then my agent, who I love, dearly because she changed my life, her name was Eunice Ewens. And she just started pushing me out for every single thing that was coming out. So I would go and I'd go to the audition and I'd come out and they'd be like, you got the role, before I even got home. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. I'm getting everything. So then she called me one day screaming like, I've got this audition. Oh my God. I can't believe it. Daniel. And I'm like, oh, what? Call me back. Take a breath and call me back.
Resend it.
I had no clue. She'd call me every week for an auditions, And I'm like, she's like, okay. I'm going to tell you, I'm so excited. I got you an audition for Star Wars. And I was a little cocky at the time, like, oh, shit, send me the script. I'll get this one too. She was like, sit me down. She, set me straight at the time. She's like, oh no, love. You won't be getting this role. And I'm like, what? She's like, but the greatest thing about this is forever onwards, we'll be able to, send you out for auditions for the kid who auditions to be the kid in Star Wars. So
it's a level up in that regard, yeah.
Just to be able to audition for a thing
it's
like
huge.
Star Wars. And I'm like, I didn't know what this whole franchise was. So I'm like, what? Okay, whatever. So I was like, send me a script. She's like, no, they don't send you a script for this kind of film. Like, you just go in and you just tell them who you are and talk to them about, you. And I'm like, that's easy. I can do that all day. So I walk into this room and, because it was so private, it was a suite at one of the hotels in New Zealand, in Auckland, and it was like one of the funny times. I walk in and then they're like, halt. My mom and my nana, they're like, you guys, wait in the lobby. And I'm like, oh, sheesh, it's all me. I'm like, I better stop pulling out all my cards. So I sat there and I was talking with the casting director and Robin Gerlin, and we were just going back and forth. And I was feeling like, okay, she kind of likes me, but like not enough at this point. So she was like, hey, Daniel, do you have any special talents? And I'm like, I got no talents, right? I'm like, everybody thinks that, right? So I'm like, well, I'm a really good liar. So I'm like, oh yeah, I got this talent. She's like, oh, well, what's your talent? And because I'm a native Maori New Zealander, we have this war dance that we do, and one of them is with something called the taiaha, which is like a very long stick, and we, So at this point, I'm like, you better start pulling out all your acting skills.
Yeah. Go full haka. Let's do this, right? Yeah.
So I'm like, do you have a stick? I mean, we're in the nicest hotel in downtown Auckland, you know. They don't have a stick in their room, you know. She's like, so I thought she would just take my word that I really knew how to do it. And she's like, no, I don't have a stick, but Daniel, this is Star Wars, so just pretend like you've got a stick in your hand. And I'm like, oh, she called my bluff. I'm like, oh, no. So I start running around this room like the Star Wars kid on YouTube. You remember that guy?
Kesslin, yeah.
Like, swinging my arms around, going, you know, and she was just moving the camera around. And you can't imagine, like, when they send that back to George, first of all, when they asked me, have you ever heard Star Wars? I'm like, no, I don't know Star Wars.
Yeah.
So I was the only kid probably auditioned that didn't know what this franchise was at the time. And then I was the only kid that, you know, ran around the room with a fake stick in my hand, pretending like I was Darth Maul or something.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like, "Hua, hua, hua." So I don't know how I actually landed the role, to be honest. I
Fell into it, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
You know,
It's the nature of the thing.
faith, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was my way of actually landing the role of Boba Fett in Star Wars. And then I got to the studio and they were like, okay, you're going to be playing the character Boba Fett. So I started watching some of the VHS tapes. And I'm like, oh, cool, what Jedi is he? And they're like, no, he's a bounty hunter. I'm like, well, what's that? So I didn't even know what a bounty hunter is.
Right.
Growing up in New Zealand, you know, you didn't have any bounty hunters.
Yeah.
You just had, you know, your neighborhood adults coming and chasing you and beating you, you know, or
Yeah.
bringing you in dead or alive. So it was a very big learning curve for me growing through Star Wars. And then it was funny because when I landed the role, my agent, she was blown away, you know, and she was like, oh my goodness, like, of course you got it, you know.
Yeah.
It was like
what
when
year
you
was
brought
that? Because I'm sitting here doing the math because, like, there's a time now, like, obviously, hi, we as Americans, like, we have this romantic idea of New Zealand now, right? But that's because, like, so many things are filmed there. But, like, I think people forget that how early Star Wars, because I think we attribute, like, the Lord of the Rings trilogy was kind of being the first major media that kind of moved in shot for shot there. But I want to say, like, that's around the same time that Peter Jackson was starting that. They were scouting for you there as well, because I'm assuming because they already brought in Tem to do Django initially, and so they wanted to make sure it was still, you know, representative of that. So I'm assuming that's right around the same time, right?
About 2000, I think I remember, 2000. But see, the crazy part about it is that they auditioned like 3,000 children worldwide for the role of Boba Fett. And like, that's like hitting the lotto, you know, and over again, you know. It's like, it's one of those things where I still today, I don't know how or why George chose me, but Tim tells this funny story. He's like, oh yeah, I took them around New Zealand and we went over to different parts of the country and I was driving a little fast. And next minute I look in my rear view, I got the casting director with me and I see the flashing lights. So I'm like, oh, well, I've got the casting director. So he pulled over confidently and the police officer comes to his window and he's like, sir, do you know how fast you were driving? He's like, I don't know how fast I was driving, but it's your lucky day. And the cop's like, what? He goes, do you know who I have here in my passenger seat? The police officer's like, no. He goes, this is the casting director for Star Wars, and you can choose any character you like. And I'm like, well, I wish I was that police officer.
Right.
I would have been a Jedi, you know. And so, you know, he's got some great stories. I mean, just meeting him was a huge thing for me because, as you said, in that time era, there wasn't very many movies that came out in New Zealand, let alone actors that you could relate to that had actually made it. So when I got involved with the acting world, he was the person that I looked up to because there was no one really else to look up to. And then when they pulled him in and he walked in the studio, you know, and I saw him, like, I was sitting with Ewan McGregor and George Lucas and all these other people, and I couldn't care less who they were. And then Tim Morrison walks in, I'm like, oh, that's Tim Morrison, you know, and I was starstruck from the minute I saw him. And he's the most lovely guy in the world. I mean, we have this father and son bond, you know, and I grew up without a father, so one of the funny things is that I actually gained a father through Star Wars because he became very much a father figure. But he would call my house and like my sister answered the phone and he's like, "Oh, is Daniel there?" So then my sister's like, we always told to ask who's speaking, you know. I was like, "Oh, yes, who's speaking?" And he replied, "Well, this is his father." So because I grew up without one, my sister, she's like, "Oh, now you finally called," and she hangs up the phone. Yeah. So he had to call back, and he's like, "No, this is the Star Wars dad, Temuera Morrison." And then my sister got starstruck. She's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison."
The horror, right?
It's like, "Daniel, Temuera Morrison's on the phone." So, it was. This whole world's been great to me, you know, and it still is great. I mean, you know, people ask, "So when are you going to come back?" And with Star Wars, you know, you'd be frozen in carbonite if you ever said a single word. But I've been blessed that they continue using me, you know.
Yeah.
And after all these years, I'm still sharing in some of the stories and what they produce nowadays.
Your fingerprints are still there, which is wild. 20 years later, like they're still like, yeah, come over back. Like they brought you back for like the Lego voice acting, doing the stuff for that, and like you're still very much a part of their chosen family as a part of this universe, which I think is awesome because how many other franchises have existed this long? None. Right?
No.
So
Star Trek is
like around that edge,
consistently, you know, it's Star Wars, and you know, for me, I did the Clone Wars series, you know, and when they asked me to come back for the Clone Wars series, I was so nervous. They were like, Dave Filoni comes up and says, like, "Hey Daniel, can you do like different voices?" And I'm like, because I didn't know what he was talking about. And then you watch the Bad Batch and you're like, "Oh, I could have done that." You know, just use different, like, "Yeah, I'm Wrecker," you know, raw, you know, tech like, "Well, I think that the likeliness of surviving this is very slim to none," you know, like, I was so young and nervous. I was just happy to be back, you know, and so as it started going through and the season started carrying on, I actually started becoming more comfortable. And then the last season, 7, was actually meant to be 4 or 5 episodes of Boba Fett. And these episodes were amazing. I mean, I had 2 big brothers growing up, and they always taught me not to cry. But I mean, as soon as I started reading these scripts, you know, like just water started leaking from my eyes. This weird thing happened, you know, and we got to take Boba Fett from where he was this kid that had just been left to being on his own, to then fighting his group, Aurra Sing, Bosk, and the gang, and then where it continued on, because we never got to see him in the armor. I mean, you got to see a little bit of the unedited footage where he was in full armor at that point. But there was a story's arcs that led up to that and how he got it, because technically he blew the helmet up. So people are like, "Oh, yeah, but you just wore Jango Fett helmet, right, and just painted it." It's like, no, he actually blew that helmet up when he went into the Mace Windu quarters. So when it came, I really want to tell the stories, but I just don't know if they're ever going to come out. And I
especially with Filoni constantly getting pulled back in. Yeah, he'll recycle stuff, because I remember like he talked about like the Siege of Mandalore and stuff. He's like, "All right, this is what I would have done had we kept doing Clone Wars," and then. Well, it turns out they finally like, "All right, you can come back and do that." It's like, well, crap. Now I wish I hadn't told everyone what I was going to do, but here it is, anyways. You know, so you're kind of in that Ouroboros of like, do I tell? Do I not tell? You know, I mean, understandable.
They were amazing stories, amazing story arcs. You know, and it really filled in the gap of where little Boba Fett left off and how it came to be that he then wore that same armor as his father. You know, and then took on that Mandalorian. That Mandalorian pride, I guess, you know, and it's funny because then when the Mandalorian came out, like, "Oh, you don't take your helmet off. Oh, Jango Fett and Boba Fett weren't like, you know, actually real Mandalorians." I'm like, what the? There was no Mandalorian without Boba Fett. That's how we know who a Mandalorian is, because the crest that he wore on his shoulder. You know what I mean? And it's like, and now you're saying he's not even one. So I got a little defensive about it as a hardcore Star Wars fan. You know, and being the fact that I got to travel with Jeremy Bulloch for so many years, I got to really learn who Boba Fett was. And I loved him, and I think he did great as Boba Fett. But some of the deliveries of the lines, you know, I'd been rehearsing for my whole life after being part of Star Wars, you know. And for me, when they asked me to come back and do the Lego game, I had to bring that knowledge that I'd learned over all those years, you know. And I don't think Tim got that same timing to be able to go back and learn the simple things as just how Boba Fett spoke, you know. And it went from, "I'm Boba Fett," to "I'm Boba Fett," You know, and every time he's advertising, like, do you know who I am? I'm Boba Fett. And I was like, Boba Fett never needed to be advertised because you knew if he was in the same room as you, you're in trouble most likely. You know, he's there for a reason, you know. And so when I did the Lego game, I had to cross-pollinate them both. I had to still have the accent of Tim, but I tried to use the delivery lines that the original Boba Fett delivered them.
Yeah, with Jeremy, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So for me, I tried to morph them both together, and then they held that whole entire game for like 4 years. And I'm like, oh, they're going to call Tim. I must have sucked so bad. They're calling Tim for sure. So I thought that's why they didn't bring it out for 4 years, because Tim was going to end up taking the voice, and then they redub me, and he would come. I'd go and play the game, and then next minute it's Tim's damn voice instead of mine. But then 4 years later, like we're saying back behind the wall, I had to ask my friends to play the game before me. And they're like, no, I think it's you. And I'm like, are you sure? And they're like, yeah, you can go on YouTube. I bet you someone's already recorded it and put it up to YouTube. So I went and watched it on YouTube before I asked Lucasfilm for the code. And then I was like, it is me. Oh, I'll play it now.
Celebration, right?
Yes, I'm back. So I was like, I'll play the game now.
Yeah. Now that I know I'm not getting, snubbed from it, it's fine. It's just that anxiety, that pride that comes from that. Also, I just want to be very clear that, like, we've been just up here rambling. If you guys have been happy with that, great. But, like, if you've got questions, I see a hand down here. I want you to just ask it up here for us.
How old are you?
Good catch. No, we're asking how old you are. 6.
You're at that fun age.
Yeah.
My son's 5. So you never know. You guys might be collecting bounties together one day. You never know. I managed to sit up here. You might be sitting up here one day too, sharing your stories. What's your question? Yes. And then they redid that in the Book of Boba Fett with Cad Bane. I'm like, that was my story. What are you doing? Yes. I was like, how
you were protective,
dare
bro. You're
you?
like, calm.
Yeah, so, for so many years, they kept asking me, like, hey, so how did Boba Fett get his dent? And, like, you have to just create your own expanded universe sometimes. That's how Star Wars survived for many years between Return of the Jedi and Phantom Menace. So I'm like, well, see, the problem was, because I didn't know that Jango Fett's helmet got blown up at the time. I was like, well, the problem was Jango Fett's head was so big that when they cut off the helmet, it got stuck in there. So I had to sit there like a coconut, hitting the head out of the helmet, and then eventually...
That tracks.
Exactly. People were like, oh, that makes sense. So then, because I became such a passionate Star Wars fan, I actually went back and I rewatched the Attack of the Clones. And then when you see the head being severed from the body, you actually see the shadow of the head, and that's how much detail George Lucas puts into these things. You see the shadowing of Jango Fett's head leave the helmet. So technically, it's so gory, but there's a head laying somewhere on that floor of Geonosis, you know what I mean? Along with the helmet. So I really should have went up and picked up the head and be like, Daddy, but for some reason he had me
pick up the helmet. Because it was a kid's movie, right?
Yeah, let's go. Kind of,
right, that line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then when they came out, and they were like, oh, actually, you're going to have this duel against Cad Bane. And there was this whole story arc where, we were hunting, and I was hunting basically. And then eventually we come to that part of space, I guess. I don't remember where it was. We find out that I do this duel against Cad Bane, and that it's his pistol that shoots off of the helmet, and that's what created the dent. So for me, that was one of the things that made me tear up, because I was like, they've now solidified me as a part of the original character. And now I could forever say that, yes, the reason why he had the helmet is because they do it against Cad Bane. But then they haven't really brought it back out. So it's like, because Dave Filoni and George showed it, is it really still canon? You know what I mean? And that whole story was kind of robbed from me, And I'm like, because the reason why those episodes weren't released is because Disney took over at the same time those episodes were about to be released. And I was sitting every week, watching the Clone Wars, and I was waiting for Tom Kane's voice. Next week on the Clone Wars, and I'm like, okay, next week they're gonna be saying that I'm coming back and this and that, and then next minute the credits started rolling. I'm like, wait, this is not the Clone Wars. The credits never roll. What the hell's happened? So then I called Lucasfilm. I'm like, hey, I think there was something wrong with the last week's episode. Like, they had credits instead of Tom Kane's voice. They were like, yeah, it's done. And that's how I found out. They didn't call me beforehand and say, hey, Daniel, we want to let you know that it's finishing and stuff like that. Disney basically watched my episodes, and they were so gory, I guess, because Boba started doing his thing at such a young age that they said they don't want to advertise kids killing. It's not what the Disney's, they project to the world. So they took all those episodes and they canned them. So it was a little disheartening for me, especially the fact that me and Corey Burton worked on those scripts for so long. I mean, Corey Burton is such a lovely man. He's a very introvert. I keep trying to get him to come to conventions.
He won't do these shows, right?
No.
Yeah.
He's like, well, I'm a little bit shy when it comes to things like that. And I'm like, no, they would love you, Corey.
He's happy in the booth, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's like, no, unfortunately, I'm going to have to pass. And I'm like, you do so great at these things, So I'm like, well, can you sign my poster then for me? Like, if you're not going to do conventions, can you at least sign my poster? So we would go over like 3 hours, for a few days. He would just be on FaceTime, and he'd help me hit those delivery lines. So the speech was just so much more better than the other episodes that I'd done, because I had a professional like Corey, like, oh, well, how about you try it like this? How about this line you underline, or this word you underline, and you try to hit that word in the sentence out of them all. And I started learning, like, oh, I get it now. And that's when my whole brain was like, ta-da! Oh, this is how you guys do this whole work. And they were amazing, So, yeah, I wasn't even, they didn't even tell me that they were going to air it at Celebration. I was sitting at my booth signing, and then next minute the line got a lot longer. And I'm like, are they in the right line? And they're like, Daniel, did you just see the unaired episode? I'm like, what are you talking about? Then they let me know about it. I'm like, they aired it? And they're like, yeah, dude, they were just aired it in the last panel. I'm like, thanks for letting me see it. Yeah, but I already
the table life, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I had to do the table thing. Yeah. So.
And that's not something they could have really coordinated with you and told, because that could have played their hand, right? Because they have to be very secretive with how I'm on this side of the convention. Like, I know how this kind of stuff works. Yeah. You got to be a little secretive. You got to know how to navigate that, especially with a lot of that IP and stuff. So it's wild. So we are.
I think they were holding it too. I don't think they were planning on showing it. And then at the end they're like, let's just give you guys a special treat.
Filoni was just like, yeah, okay, let's do the thing. Yeah.
We've got it there, showing the guys. So
it's very Dave move there.
Yeah.
But we got to wrap things up because we are about at time. So real quick, last chance for a question. No? All right, jump. Yeah, go for it.
So with all you've seen with everything that's come out of Star Wars, and I think I may have heard an answer, but where would you ideally plug yourself in if you were to do it again? The skills you have, the stuff you've learned, where would you love to see Boba Fett in this myriad of content that they have?
All right, short answer time. See if you can do it.
Oh yeah,
no pressure.
I'm a long answer.
I know, yeah. That's why I like to preface it there.
Well, see, the thing with Star Wars is that because there's so much time to fill, you know what I mean? Especially between now the Clone Wars and A New Hope, there's so much time that we could fill that gap now, and all I can say is, my bounties are far from over, and there's a lot more stuff that hopefully will come out and they can. But I think we need to see like what everyone wanted to see in the Book of Boba Fett, those bounty hunts, how these relationships got established between Boba Fett and the other bounty hunters, how did he go about first learning how to start to deal with how much credits he's going to charge, how we go about trying to find these people and stuff like that, and actually succeeding on doing the hunt and bringing in the people, whoever they may be from the galaxy. So I think those are some of the stories that a lot of people, not only me, but a lot of people want to see, and the Book of Boba Fett was great because it kept where Boba Fett ended up. but it doesn't take away from all those years that we have to fill in through bounties and hunting and also relationships building and stuff like that too, you know, so.
It's an untapped era there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right on. Well, cool. We're going to have to wrap it up, though, because it is at time. You guys have been awesome. Yeah. Thanks for making out. I want to make sure you give yourself a round of applause for being here. And for our friend Daniel, I want you guys to give him a huge thank you as well. Make it sound. So where can they catch you out on the floor for the rest of the day? Are you going to be at your table? What's your plan?
Yeah, I'm going out to the table. I just flew in last night, so I got the day to
make up for some time.
Yeah, I gotta get back to the signing grind. But I just want to thank you guys. You know, I know it just opened up, and you guys, you know, didn't have to take your time out of your morning to come listen to me ramble on about Star Wars. But I really do appreciate you guys taking your time to come sit and listen. Even if there's one person, I used to be I say drunk, but I used to like to drink. Yeah. So even if there was one person, I probably would be like, hey, let's go over to the bar and I'll tell you some real stories. You know what I mean? So it doesn't matter if there's 1, 5, you know, thousands. It's about being able to share a little bit of what I got to enjoy in my life. And I'm just so grateful you guys sat and listened to my story. So thank you all. Cool. And have a wonderful convention. Yeah. Enjoy your guys' day.
This is Captain Zap Brannigan. I prefer to call myself Admiral Zap Brannigan. I'd like to draw your attention to that sexy subscribe button, those curves, that triangle. Like Leela's eye. Click it. Ah, that was great. Follow fun and have fandom and yabo.